I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today our guest is Lama Justin von Bujdoss. Lama Justin is an American Vajrayana Buddhist teacher, writer, and is the co-founder of Bhumi Sparsha, an experimental Buddhist Sangha, along with Lama Rod Owens. He is the author of Modern Tantric Buddhism. Justin has served as the executive director of chaplaincy and staff wellness for the New York City Department of Correction. Justin was ordained as a Repa, a lay tantric yogin in the tradition of Milarepa. If you enjoyed today's conversation and you want to listen to the previous conversation with Lama Justin, you can see the link in the podcast page for that particular episode. From what I understand, you have an interest in the 9th to 11th century Dharma transference from Indian to Tibetan culture. And what is it about this transition in particular that intrigues you?
It's a great question. And I think one of the things that's very fascinating for me is that transference from one cultural location to another cultural location. And it's very easy, I think, probably to look at this from a kind of romantic standpoint in the sense of, it just was magically transplanted from the lower Indian subcontinent, I guess you could say, to northern Indian subcontinent, including the Himalayan plateau, and et cetera, Sikkim, Nepal. And when we look at lineage prayers, which are wonderful, right? Like praying back all the way to, in the case, let's say, of the Kagyu, going back to Gampopa, Milarepa, Marpa, and then back, right? That's where this crossover happens into India, Naropa, Tilopa, etc. And then with the Mahamudra tradition going back even slightly further in time to Shavaripa, Saraha, etc. There's a lot that's missed. I mean, we're missing this whole thing, this whole transference from the Indian subcontinent and its culture and the kind of predilections around the way the culture manifests, what's important, what's emphasized, what's not emphasized, into Tibetan culture, which was not the same, passing through, interestingly enough, Nepali culture, which actually is this very kind of fascinating hybrid synthesis, very rich, unique culture of its own, into Tibetan culture. And so we see this kind of like really polished, shiny end product that also has been like polished over centuries in Tibet. I think that somehow we expect here, why I like this topic is because sometimes we expect Dharma to be naturally polished upon dissemination here in, for example, in the United States. And when we look at, in Marpa's biography, for example, he ended up going to study with, Naropa sent him to study with one of Naropa's contemporaries, Sri Santibhadra, who is also, I believe, the Master of Kukuripa. And Kukuripa, or Sri Santibhadra, calls Marpa stupid, flat-nosed Tibetan from the north. And so the Tibetans sometimes were thought of by their Indian counterparts as barbarians from the north thing. And so just what I do enjoy doing is taking some real time to feel into what that process must have been like for Marpa, who from all accounts had a really intense personality. And he's like going down to Tibet, and all of a sudden he has to encounter polyculture, change of temperature, change in food, bandits, different kinds of illnesses, and then going down into India, to these very classical seats of Buddhist learning, and to meet with panditas who are just like, or siddhas, both of whom are like, who are you? Like, why should I give you this? And having to, on some level, prove himself, I'm sure, on another level, relationship build, how to garner the trust of one's teacher, for example, in this particular setting, so that Naropa would open up to taking him seriously, and to understanding the seriousness of his intention to study Dharma and practice Dharma, and then to give him instruction and to nurture him as should ideally happen in this teacher-student relationship. So there's a lot that happens in these, depending on how you want to look at it, 3 centuries, 4 centuries. Sometimes we'll just gloss over, it might be 1 page in a book. And we find ourselves, you and I, and people of our generation, people of the previous generation, and then probably people of the next 2 generations on that 1 page. And whether or not that page actually leads to another page because of the environmental crisis is another thing. But we are living through a very similar kind of time and process, at least in my perspective.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. There's so much in there. It really is so dense in terms of psychology and relationship and identity and time, like what happens over time. And I'm interested too, just if there's any particular hagiographies that you feel a kinship with. Like you've mentioned Marpa, you've mentioned a few other really main adepts and scholars. Are there people in particular that when you've read that page, there's something that it's activated for you in terms of feeling maybe more potential in your own life as a practitioner?
Yeah. Just recently, I think it was Wisdom Publications. I think it is Wisdom Publications, I could be wrong though, has published a series of books on different people's lives. And so in the series, I think there's like Gendon Chopel, there's Dorje, Third Karmapa, but there's this one on Maitripa. And Maitripa is, he's so special to me. So Maitripa was one of Marpa's Mahamudra teachers and figured very largely in the way Mahamudra was taught, especially like in the early Kagyu. And whether or not actually Maitripa actually met Marpa is up for debate. I think in Marpa's biography, if I'm not mistaken, they met in a dream. Who knows if they actually met? But in his biography is really powerful. There's Klaus Dieter Mathis has done a tremendous amount of translation work, of literary work, and then I think penned that book. And then there are 2 or 3 hagiographies in a large work on Maitripa's. It's a Serkandesa text that was translated by Naga Isaacson, partially translated by Harunaga Isaacson. And in one of those biographies, anyway, sorry, this is a long-winded thing, but in these biographies, we find that Maitripa had been a monastic scholar, basically, and at one point, basically, he left the monastery because he understood that he didn't understand Mahamudra in particular, and went to go find a teacher. And he and a traveling companion happened upon Shavarripa. And Shavarripa was this very kind of interesting person because it seems as if he was a member of an indigenous non-Hindu, non-Buddhist group, an indigenous group to the Indian subcontinent, non-Brahmanical perhaps, and dressed unconventionally in images. He's got this like peacock feather skirt, and Maitripa meets him, and in one instance he's picking lice out of his hair and eating them, and Maitripa's like, oh, who's this guy? I'm not gonna I don't know who this is, but this is not my teacher. And has this multiple run-ins with him. And each time the only thing he's really seeing are his own projections of, oh no, this can't be a great siddha because it's crazy. And what also ends up happening is he becomes increasingly depressed. And there are, in the biography that Harunaga Isaacson translated, there are 2 or 3 instances, it might be as many as 3 instances, where he tries to commit suicide. And this piece is very easy to gloss over. And in some cases, in his biographies, it is almost like a literary device. Person so was so distraught that they were, I'm going to take my own life. And it can read a little bit like a Hindi film, where people are just like, it's that level of drama. But then when we stop and begin to feel into it and really consider what is being conveyed, right? It's the sense of complete brokenness, complete dejection, complete dissatisfaction and unhappiness with myself, my experience of life, the constancy of the suffering of life, and being at this just incredibly difficult but also full existential point in one's life, right, where anything could happen, right? Yes, perhaps one could self-harm, or perhaps there's a richness to that moment that allows us to be able to take the step needed to go much more deeply into practice, and especially to confront our fears, our anxieties, the way that we almost prefabricate our ideas about the way things have to be. And in his story, Shavarippa shows up and he's just, what's wrong with you? Why are you so upset? Why are you about to throw away this precious human life? You clearly don't understand what is possible. And then, of course, he disappears. And meanwhile, his traveling companion was like, oh, I have faith in this like great Siddha, and receives instruction and achieves awakening. And Maitripa then has to deal with that. And then he very cautiously is like, okay, fine, let me take initiation from this person and practice. And he goes out into the jungle to do retreat, and everything transforms. He's able to realize Mahamudra. And then, interestingly enough, he's like, Guruji, like I'm going to stay here with you in the forest and be a Shabara just like you. And he's like, what are you, crazy? You're a scholar. Go back to the monastery and write about this. Introduce this into the monastery. Teach this. And so he does, and he leaves this very rich corpus of literature, which impacted Gempopa, obviously impacted Marpa, impacted Milarepa, but Gempopa especially seemed to align very closely with his kind of pedagogy around how Mahamudra was taught and introduced to students. We can easily accidentally accumulate tons and tons of namtars, and I'm going to read about this person, that person, and it's wonderful, right? It can be a really powerful way of inspiring ourselves. And at the same time, if we really feel into them, we can get past a lot of what I like to think of as like the propaganda of any given lineage to show how shiny everything is, to the real kind of human side of this. And I think that there's a lot, especially in that time period, around people who were ordained as ordained Sangha, who in the monastery system realized, I have the intellectual understanding of this down pat, but I don't have the experience. And then they have to go to these people who are very challenging to their ethical mores, challenging to their ideas of how Dharma ought to look, and get really uncomfortable to the point of near suicide in some cases. And that says a lot to me, too, about being a little bit more loose and open and free and experimental now, too. If this was the case, I mean, imagine a Shavarippa now, even just existing now, it would just be incredible. I would be very happy to be put through any trial that they offered me. And so here, though, we have such an unusually strange relationship to Dharma knowledge, right? Training. So like you can go to the Lama of Amazon and order your books, and then you can self-study. And so that's good and bad. It's a mixed bag. But then we have these ideas of finished final product, and some of those have been presented to us by lineages that have helped finish these images over millennia now. Or we have our own kind of Western ideas around contemporary spirituality and what it looks like to be successful in that. And that too also provides some kind of image or model that is, when we stop and think about it, a little strange, like marketplace driven, not driven by actual experience. And so what it tells me is that as practitioners, we need to go deeply into our practice, and we need to let that churn like a compost heap. And sometimes it's wonderful, sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's ecstatic, sometimes it's low energy. And after time, the product, we will become that finished product. But I think the one thing that is most important is not developing any preconceived notions about what that will look like.
Yeah.
I don't think we can know what that will essentially look like. I think we can intuit to an extent the direction this seems to be going, but how we manifest is really about closing our eyes and doing, I think, often.
Yeah, that's really powerful instruction right there. Like just to be left in that compost heap. And yeah, I like the piece too of just letting the intuition also be a part of there, like opening up that channel of wisdom as well. I guess maybe going to grounded practice question for you. Do you feel like there's a confusion between Hatha yoga or dzogchen and Shamatha vipassana? Like, where do people confuse those two? What do you think the confusion is for some people?
I think two things, like shamatha and vipassana are really vital practices. And we find this definitely, especially within the context of Mahamudra, because shamatha and vipassana form what has become the long-standing kind of tradition. I think we could also probably say, as was found in monasteries, passed down. So first is training in shamatha, and then a introduction to vipassana or laktong, and then learning how to be able to combine the two, which is a very kind of gentle and intuitive process. And then from this union of stability of mind and the quiescence that's created by that, and the insight that is a product of being able to rest into the experience of the mind's ability to know itself, right? Then this much more pervasive Mahamudra and very similar to Hatha Yoga experience arises. But with Hatha Yoga in particular, my feeling and experience with it is that it is much more sudden and freestyle, so to speak. The suddenness has a lot more to do with this understanding, and this is not any different necessarily than as finished products, so to speak, or finished experiences. There really isn't any difference between Mahamudra and Hatha Yoga, especially as if we're just talking about Trekcha. And within the context of Hatha Yoga or dzogchen, a fundamental understanding of the primordial constancy of Rigpa, whether we're aware of it or not, is a very helpful way of remembering that in the suddenness of just resting into awareness, we're kind of, so in some contexts we talk about the merging of the mother clear light and the child clear light. It is as if the constant primordial purity of Rigpa is there all the time. It's an expression of our Buddha nature. It is constant. It is always there. When we're flying from one place to another, there may be atmospheric conditions, clouds, etc., that obscure the ability to see directly space, but above that, at some point, is just clarity, right? The clarity of space itself. Our Buddha nature itself is that clarity. And with the practice of Hatha Yoga, we'll learn how to be able to relax into being able to have direct relationship with that. And obviously, it's not always relaxation, because relaxing can also mean a sudden shift in perspective. This can happen in life experience, a death, something that arrests the conceptual mind, right? Arrests the thing that is producing very naturally all these atmospheric conditions that in and of themselves have no real reality to them, but they seem particularly real and full of energy and compelling, that sometimes we'll have an experience that arrests that and we can just see very clearly. My experience of Hatha Yoga, I'll definitely say I'm not an expert, but my experience of it is that resting freely and openly is experienced generally differently than the practice of Mahamudra with shamatha, vipassana, with steps, so to speak. That being said, when we look at the instructions of Mahasiddhas from 9th to 10th century in India and with Mahamudra, then we get these very quick cutting dzogchen like Mahamudra instructions, which just, Saraha was particularly powerful with this. Tilopa and his Ganges Mahamudra is especially powerful at this. Maitripa also quite good at just stopping, just cutting. And it's fascinating too, because one does have to wonder about the impact that the pedagogic system through which these different forms of meditation pass through time has impacted the way they're taught, right? So Mahamudra, we find obviously in the Kagyu traditions, in the Geluk tradition, and then to some extent in the Sakya tradition. And those are all very monastic lineages these days. And so there is this kind of step-by-step pedagogy. First you do this, and you do that, and you do this, and you do that. Whereas in the Nyingma tradition, there's quite a long parallel track of more yogic Nakpa style or Nakma style maintenance of a practice lineage that I think had a lot of wealth in it, because there's the use of, we could say, more poetry, much more everyday kind of experience, and an emphasis on sudden direct experience, and then coming back, training and coming back to that, and coming back. It definitely helps to have a grounding in shamatha for the practice of Hatha Yoga, just so that your mind's not a jumble. That being said, I think no matter which tradition it is, whether or not it's Hatha Yoga or Mahamudra, one also needs to have a really healthy, realistic relationship to what stability and shamatha can mean. Because sometimes we'll say, oh, I need to be able to stare at this candle for 2 hours, and then my shamatha is good enough. And it's like, okay, good luck. That will take you a long time. And so while also keeping in mind the relative shortness of life. And then also on top of that, the very fact of Buddha nature is the way it is. The mind is inherently liberated as it is. And we can start off in a slightly overly pragmatic way and say, I'm really going to build this foundation. And we're just only looking down at the foundation, and we're not looking at what it is we're trying to do. We're crystallizing something and making it like solid and solid and solid and solid. But mind is space. So how to have a relationship between pragmatic grounding in practices that are helpful to realize meditation experience, while at the same time keeping ourselves open to the fact that these clouds pass sometimes very quickly, and the clouds aren't solid. That's like with dreams, right? Sometimes our dreams can be incredibly prophetic, and then sometimes it's just mundane stuff. And so it's not always, progressive. And that, far be it from me to criticize lamrim literature, but I think the one unintended problem caused by lamrim literature is this idea of a progressive path, slowly, step by step. And there is an element definitely of safety in doing that. Safety in the sense of, I don't know why, lately I've been thinking of that song, like inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. So it's like inch by inch, row by row, gonna experience Dharmakaya. But then sometimes it just happens. And so how to be able to have a relationship that holds both.
I really love that you bring this up, because I think about it often. Where are we holding these teachings as another means to perpetuate a culture of control and of safety and also hierarchy? I remember you were sharing in your book this story with your teacher, and you talk about how she takes naps, and that was really important. I'm interested, just this line that you're speaking of, when are we getting too effortless and relaxed, and when are we getting too tight and focused more on this kind of working towards rigor, this small view? And how can one within themselves as a practitioner notice? I mean, I know we talk about not too tight, not too loose, but I'm curious your thoughts on that, just if one's reflecting in their own practice where they're moving towards.
What's fascinating to me, like connected to all of this, is one of the first things Sunma Tetsuzamo did when I'm, shortly after meeting her, she's like, oh, here's this book. It's really good. You should copy it out by hand. And it was Flight of the Garuda. And so I remember like reading it and copying it out by hand. And I have it somewhere still after all these years and decades now, even. And I remember reading it and just being like, oh my God, this is amazing and reassuring and soothing. And I'm exceptionally grateful that that is the place. That's what she gave. It wasn't, and again, I don't mean to disrespect lamrim, but it's not this, oh, here's this ladder and don't miss a rung. Otherwise, you're going to go to hell. So it's a very open, inviting, reflective, vital, relaxed, but spacious place to begin. And very much, and this is something I appreciate. I mean, I appreciated her no matter what, constantly, but definitely probably at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where I had this real deep interest in the difference in, especially with respect to Mahamudra, the pedagogy that Maitripa demonstrated and that Gampopa also, I think you could say, advanced. And then and how controversial that was. And with both Maitripa and Gampopa, the first things they would do would be to introduce students to the nature of mind. And if they got it, then the thinking was, well, then you don't need to do all of this progressive practice. Like, just let's focus on that. And if people are like, hey, that was weird, but like you said something, I don't even know what it means. And huh? Then they would say, okay, now to do all this stuff. And it's not, and it should never be interpreted as a judgment, right? This is just a really rooted in this loving pragmatism of assessing. And this is where I think my chaplaincy is very helpful, is being comfortable with a natural, relaxed spiritual assessment and seeing that, okay, this is where this person is. We don't need to try and fry them. We don't need to try and intimidate them. We don't need to introduce this concept of non-duality too early, because that leads to people thinking, oh, I'm awakened, I can do whatever I want, and all of that. And it also highlighted, I've then done a lot of kind of research and looking at how unacceptable these pedagogies were by certain lineage masters of different schools, who are like, no, like you can't, Mahamudra can only be practiced after one accomplishes a Yidam and receives full empowerment. It has to be the fourth empowerment in order to be able to practice Mahamudra. And both Maitripa and Gampopa were more of the opinion that doesn't matter. There is not necessarily even a correlation necessarily between the Yidam practice and nature of mind practice. And recently I found a passage, and I think it was David Germano wrote about how Longchenpa said something very similar, that you can try and force the winds into the central channel all of these ways with all these Maha Yoga practices, but the nature of mind was pure before you started that, and the nature of mind was the same after you did it. Like, why engage in all of that needless effort, right? Why not rest the mind in its essential nature? So now these are the kind of places I connect to as a teacher. And I directly recognize that my root teacher, Tsuma Dechinzamo, was of that same kind of, you could even say, teaching lineage thread. And this is powerful because why not start there? And why not cultivate a sense of ease? I mean, there are so many reasons why control is something that we end up picking up from religious systems, and then culture, so patriarchy, all of this fear. And why I think relaxation and the kind of relaxed relationship to Mahamudra and Nati Yoga is so important is because it allows us to be able to experience a felt sense of release from fear. Hope and fear really mess with our ability to engage in practice. And it's not that when hope and fear are present, we can't practice. That's not true. We can. But when hope and fear become the brackets that contain our practice, then our practice is contained and does not necessarily have the same efficacy because we're afraid. When introducing the direct experience of spaciousness of mind, for example, it is not uncommon for people to feel scared. There's this almost kind of recoil, like, oh my gosh, this is like a death. And it is a little bit like a little death. But as we feel into it, it's alive and vibrant and holds everything and is exceptionally rich. It's this rich, direct experience. And we are not taught, at least I can only really speak for as an American, we're not really taught to let our hair down or let our belt out and just, right, we hold everything. It's fascinating too, when you begin to consider whiteness in this regard too, this like hardcore control that like we need to have not only on, I mean, there's ourselves, right? Like almost inner constipation, but then as well, I must control everything. It must be quiet when I practice. It must be like this. It must look like, a page out of Mindful magazine. It must be all of this stuff. I must have the appropriate Dharma clothing. My shrine must be like this. And that's how I know I'm serious. It's like really weird. It's like easing into all of this and relaxing brings practice down, and especially Mahamudra and Nati Yoga, down to the level of ordinary being, which is all we are. Ordinary animals with this brain that is wired to make us think that we're the penultimate beings on this planet, that we control everything, that we create the meaning that justifies and dignifies everything. And it's fascinating too, because Anizamba also taught Tilopa's 6 nails, was the first person to introduce that, and Bokar Rinpoche did that. All these teachers of mine. And I've been teaching, relying heavily on that and in my own practice because of just the radical nature of what it means to relax our mind, especially in relationship to time. Like she was one of my teachers, and that kind of one of my primary Mahamudra teachers. And I still remember when he was teaching the Mahamudra style of vipassana, and there was this style of inquiry, I guess we could say, of resting into the mind beyond time. And I just remember at that time in my life, I was probably in my late 20s, just being blown away by the capability of the fact that mind is beyond 3 times. And then we look at Tilopa's 6 nails, let go of the past, let go of the future, let go of anything having to do with what we conceive of the present. And what happens when we let ourselves relax out of the 3 times? What happens when we don't analyze going on with his instructions, and we don't examine, when we're not controlling, and then just rest into pure being? And it's fascinating because one has to wonder, what is all the fear of being too loose about? When I first started working in hospice, I was driving around the city all the time, and I was like, oh man, there's a lot of time in traffic. So I was like, oh, let me check out different Buddhist podcasts. And so I remember listening to one by Ken MacLeod, and he had this funny thing. He said, he was like, Mahamudra and dzogchen don't help you with balancing your checkbook. It's not practical. And I think it's important to remember this too, because again, in our culture, at least in the United States, there always needs to be the justification of some kind of positive impact this is going to have on my professional work. So how is Mount Lucha going to make me much more productive at the workplace? My sincere hope is that it makes everybody useless at the workplace, and that we're able to just tune out, so to speak, from this very artificial way of being that we've created for ourselves. And now when you look at all the algorithms that kind of seem to dictate everything, we have really accidentally created a prison-like experience that might seem like it has a lot of benefit and, I guess you could say, convenience, but it really reduces our ability to just be.
Yeah, it makes me think of the creation and development phases in practice, like Yidam practice, and this kind of like deathless, regenerative aspects as you share the benefits of it, even for like in a modern way. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that, because as you share, I have this vision of how wonderful it is that we have these practices, or we can create and then we have to completely give it away. It's something that seems so actually useful.
Yeah. I mean, Yidam practice is fascinating. I remember sitting in a teaching that Dr. Nida Chanatsang gave in Brooklyn in 2016, and he was talking about, and this is a very nice, different way of thinking about this. He's talking about how Yidam practice, in a way, if we think about it, is like a working of the neural patterns in our brain around identity and self and location. So in terms of body, speech, and mind. And it's fascinating because one of a huge problem, I think, in our culture is everybody feels in one way or another, or at one time or another, not good enough, not whatever enough. Depression rates are super high, that there's all of this stuff. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that I am not good enough. The kind of culture that is produced by our culture in terms of media is almost very assaultive around just pure natural being as we are. And practice is wonderful because when we're able to really get into it, then we are able to identify with the particular deity, begin to really get into the granularity of shifting experience, so to speak, from being the locus of a samsaric being to the locus of a being that's not only like arising out of light, but is an expression of the infinite. And then to understand location as the mandala, right, and the unity that that creates in the sense of pure being as a result of that. And then speech, so all sound becomes the expression of the mandala. And then mind. Mind is nothing other than the natural state of the deity. The deity has no location specifically in relationship to spatial relationship, right? The deity can be as vast as the universe, can be as small as a mustard seed. And being able to get into all of that is extraordinary. I mean, deity practice is amazing. And then the dissolution of that. I mean, talk about, I mean, I don't mean to be a salesperson, but talk about bliss, like this kind of just complete release from that into resting into direct experience is just. And so both of these things, right, especially in a capitalist culture where I am creating, let me hold on to this amazing creation that I made, then it dissolves into just, as is said in text, like a rainbow dissolving in the sky. And then what are we left with? We're left with the experience of recognition of the nature of mind, the ability to rest into Rigpa. And both of these things are, again, we could probably say they're a little, like, when fully engaged, are countercultural, right? They bust open this narrative that's often used to sell us goods. You're not good enough, you're not beautiful enough, you're not smart enough, you're not whatever enough, so that we can settle into our original state. And then the release is just, at some point, we have to give all of this up. And so this, which is a very useful, there's a useful secondary benefit of how all this impacts our ability to allow the death process to happen when it does, so that we're not, I've accumulated all of this, I have all of these roles, I'm a parent, perhaps at that point I'll be a grandparent, perhaps X, Y, and Z. And if we just let that go, it's quite powerful.
It really is. Can we talk about afflictive emotions for a moment?
Sure.
What are your thoughts on using our emotions skillfully so we don't misuse our kleshas, but we also don't negate the fact that within them is our wisdom, is the nature of who we are?
Yeah. Yeah, this is, again, Olivia, a wonderful question. Where I land is a more kind of in a shabkar, saraha, hopefully kind of space. With these, as a practitioner, I'm definitely more comfortable in terms of solitary contemplative practice, meditation, of course, reflection, study, and more meditation. Because what is most important to me is, yes, the experience of kleshas. I mean, if you really want to experience kleshas, it's wonderful to be a layperson in a relationship with kids and to just go through the demands of time, the demands around needing to compromise and things like this. And I cite Shabkar and Saraha in the sense that I think that we can have all of the unintended expressions of our kleshas arise. And if we can do this through the lens of trying to rest into Rigpa as that happens and look at the source, look at what is being expressed, look at where is it coming from. Yes, I might be feeling anger viscerally, but where is anger? What is anger? From where does it arise? From where does it settle back into? I'm much more interested in looking at how we can, on an individual level, begin to touch into the experience of the spaciousness that is inherent in all kleshas arising: attachment, aversion, greed, jealousy, and then also sadness, depression. And COVID, the one beautiful thing about COVID is it has just afforded us a wealth of things to practice with: anxiety, fear. There's some people for whom there's rage against the government because they feel like their rights are being impeded. So practice into that rage. I actually think that it would be lovely if there could be more research into the trauma experienced by teachers like Trungpa Rinpoche and that generation. People who left Tibet, fled Tibet under the kind of duress of violence, and not just violence to themselves, violence to their quote unquote nation state, to their culture, to loved ones, to cultural items, everything from architecture to art and everything. And it's just wholesale destruction. And the survival of that and the pressure of what it means to survive that, and whether or not it means just remaining on the Indian subcontinent and trying to rebuild there, or coming to the West. And we don't talk so much about the relationship between trauma and the attraction to crazy wisdom. And it's an interesting thing to maybe look at a little bit. So I'm curious about whether or not we can engage very deeply with the expression of all of our kleshas as they arise. And so whether or not it's just kleshas arising as reactivity or kleshas arising out of deep truths, deep experiences that we have had, sometimes out of our own traumatization. For me, one thing that hurts quite a bit is I don't really know where or even whether or not this started in this life, but there's something about maleness and patriarchy that really terrifies me. The like intenseness of the male reaction to things, what it means to be male, what it means. And so I will find myself, and I was in a situation recently in the past week where I would just came face to face with somebody who was just like masculine, male, controlling, intense. I was just like, I felt like a little kid. I felt like a child in that. And it's not that they were belittling me so much, a little bit, but that automatic klesha reaction just arose. And I guess in that particular case, what I tried to do was hold this so that I could experience what was happening and do my best to just allow this to self-liberate by not poking, not chasing, not etc. While at the same time, and I think this is possible, is to hold that experience in the moment while it is self-liberating with a sense of curiosity around the full range of everything that's there. We could say maybe the emotional energy. And then let that self-liberate, right? Just let that go. And I feel like that is a much more skillful thing to do and much more important thing to do, and perhaps even a much more responsible thing to do, because we're not aerating all of this and sharing it. Because again, we may be able to go very deeply into ourselves in that way and into experience as so with respect to being, right? We are constantly reacting to light, sound, everything through all of our senses. And we can either let all of these things arise and be released into the spaciousness of mind, or sometimes we find ourselves reacting and we can either experience that reaction and also experience what is coming up within us. That is a very responsible, powerful way of engaging with everything that arises. So the things we see as we move. So as I move through New York City and just liberating, and this is where practice really becomes powerful, because we can take it off the cushion and we can be practicing all the time. We don't need to develop a narrative of, oh, I need to be living in a gompa somewhere with a shaved head and forsake my wife and kids and cause harm around that. But then it also means that I'm avoiding displaying everything. And this is the thing, right? There's this like narcissism in the United States where it's all about me. And so I'm going to express crazy wisdom that's all about me, and you all need to deal with it. And if you can't deal with it, you don't understand. That's just crazy. I like my practice to be like the practice of a bird sitting in a tree and observe, rest, practice. I don't need to get a projector and show it to everybody else.
Yeah. Really feeling a lot of what you're sharing. And I think it really brings to heart that Vajrayana is so provocative. It's not necessarily for everyone. There's just such a range of perception that we can have, right? Including in the relational realm. And specifically the relational realm, I have some questions about for you. And I guess the range of perception, I'll just mention a few examples to ground us into the same field. I guess in the most general sense, Vajrayana uses sensual engagement for self-realization, karma mudra, or sexual union, to reveal treasures or to unbind certain knots in the body. It has this eternal commitment to return to samsara until all beings are liberated, as well as a history of what you were saying, like yogis practicing in extreme solitude. I mean, and also these monastics that will never experience physical union or physical intimacy. And there's a lot of misunderstanding in Vajrayana around intimacy in relationship. And I'm curious, from your perspective, because you're willing to wonder and not necessarily just stay in the bounds of how things are currently in play, what are your thoughts about Vajrayana as a relational path, as well as Vajrayana and its need to, or what you would like to see it adjust, how it could adjust in terms of relational pathways? if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Maybe one place to start is by expressing tremendous gratitude for everything that brought Dharma here to the West, for example, and how, so for me, personal gratitude for, especially over this past generation, everybody who had experienced what they had experienced with the Tibetan cultural genocide and the insight to move things to safer places, Nepal, Bhutan, and then, of course, into the West, and the tremendous gratitude for the trust placed in being able to see that this is able to be transmitted over such a big cultural leap. I have a tremendous amount of gratitude to all the lineages for that. And that is very important to me. And not being born of that story, that is also not necessarily my work to do, right? The preservation of a particular culture, which is not necessarily my own. I mean, I love Tibetan culture. I especially love Indian. And where I see my work in all of this is this kind of cultural translation, practice translation into whatever we could say this like idiom, contemporary idiom and ethos is, which, given all of the energy behind Tantra and the ethos of experimentation, means that there is much more room to experiment than I think we necessarily recognize. And when we are not practicing within the context of what we might say is like a monastic tantric system, there's even more room, right? Because we don't have the need to maintain everything connected to that. And not maintaining a monastic tradition does not mean that it's not authentic. And the propagation of, let's say, a more yogic tradition or a Nakpa tradition has to be able to look different and arise differently here than it would in Tibet or Bhutan or Nepal, et cetera. And so that's complex, though, because, yes, with respect to things like karma mudra and the embrace of desire on the path, the transformation of desire on the path, there are many kind of, I think you could probably say, cultural impediments to this being able to be understood the way it has arisen within the tantric milieu specifically. And this has a lot to do with the various lenses through which people are looking at this. And that's definitely not to say that any lenses that exist are inauthentic. I mean, there's been a lot of work. Serenity Young has done a lot of great work. Miranda Shaw, June Campbell, and others on showing all of the patriarchy and inequality that may exist within, especially with respect to sexual practices like karma mudra, etc. And I think it's also important to own the fact that, unlike the transmission of Vajrayana from India to Tibet, the transmission of Vajrayana from the East to the West involves interacting with a deep programming around Abrahamic faith values and Puritanism, in particular in the United States. And so it's not as if like sexuality was like a real easy thing to talk about before. So we have this problem, how to be able to talk frankly and openly and creatively about sexuality. And like in the United States, like when you still have people who are like, you can't have all gender bathrooms. When like in state government buildings, right? Of course we can't have a conversation about this, right? Like when we can't talk about abortion, we can't talk about this. When, we of course we can talk about it, but in a way, aspects of our culture are so not ready for that. And so there is a lot of work. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done that doesn't reduce Vajrayana to, oh, it's just a way of controlling women. Because yes, there's patriarchy in Vajrayana as much as there's patriarchy in most things, but it was not intentionally crafted to subjugate women. I mean, that's not what Guru Rinpoche obviously was thinking, nor most siddhas, etc. And there is a ironic paternalism in that argument as well. And so it gets hard, right? It's important to recognize what we could say is the wisdom tradition, or to make an argument from more kind of Robert Thurman perspective, the spiritual science of Tantra, to be able to see it, hold it, engage it, acknowledge it, and not colonize it to make it more appropriate for our mindset. Maybe our mindset can use a little challenging from time to time. Because at the end of the day, like, these instructions are meant to liberate. And there are plenty of people who in the past who have been liberated by them completely. And I think another problem here in America is our hardcore obsession with faith and our ironic lack of faith. We're obsessed with religious practice here in the United States. It is, in the United States, this is what the Western culture part of it, at least, was predicated on religious pilgrims coming here to be able to practice faith freely and purely and have a direct relationship with God. And the communities that first came from Europe moved around, and they often moved when they thought, oh man, this city has gotten out of control. We need to go to a new place and do this. And this constant search for purity, right? Never do people think, oh, I am pure. It's got to be some other thing. So I would hope that as Vajrayana develops here, that there still remains this ability to provoke and push and hold accountable these much more dominant Abrahamic ways of thinking, because I think, unfortunately, as long as we're caught in this binary, right, there will be suffering. It's just the way it is. We can't reform criminal justice until we've looked at a non-binary way of looking at what that could be. Like, what is this third way? What is this other option? I don't think Vajrayana practitioners need to be apologists either. And I think that we have to be careful about, it's not for fear of watering down Dharma, so to speak. Again, how do you water down that which is perfect and unable to be transformed or changed, or it is as it is? But I think we need to be a little careful about excusing our own ego from changing the equation because it is uncomfortable. And so I think that's the reason why we need to be a little careful of making Vajrayana non-confrontational. There are points where we will hurt, and it's not because Vajrayana is bad, nor is it because we're bad. It's because of all of the clouds, it's because of all the veils or all of the different lenses that are preventing us from looking and experiencing things directly. Yeah, so I think there's a tremendous room for growth and allowing this to come in and percolate inside of our culture. I do think that it might be helpful for us to imbibe more and consume more in the sense of a Eucharistic kind of relationship to Dharma, where we are eating it and it is becoming part of us. And then we're no longer, like for me, for example, like it is not a foreign faith tradition. When I was working as a chaplain, I would often find myself in these ecumenical prayer ceremonies and stuff. And the moment people would start talking about God, like part of I just couldn't, I was like, huh? What's that? Then that's when I realized, oh yeah, this has really become innately part of you now. And so may that continue in the hearts and minds of people. May we consume this and may it become part of us. And may we not be scared of that. May we rest into a real stable joy in that. And then may we have confidence in what comes next, right? Because this isn't about saying, oh, now there needs to be an American Tantra or American Sutra, and now we need to write the American Tantra or American Sutra or whatever. Is starting off with such a intentional idea, it will arise naturally through all of us. And that is where the natural expression will be. And it will arise through our mistakes. And then it will arise through our solutions to those mistakes. It will arise through everything through how we speak and conceive of things, through our art, through our music, because nothing starts. Tibet is perhaps the only place where they were like, let's craft this literary language to be a bridge for Buddhist knowledge, right? That was incredibly insightful and amazingly unique in terms of a human cultural activity to purposefully bridge like that. And so for us, because we're not doing that, we need to wait for this to come up and through us. But part of that means being comfortable with confronting and interrogating our own kind of assumptions and blind spots. And some of that has to do with our education. And then the other thing is, and I don't necessarily have a super strongly formulated opinion on this, but Tantra in the middle of like the capitalist marketplace doesn't make sense to me. And it's not that it should be removed and brought into secrecy because it's all about sex, but because it's internal. My practice is internal. Like when I go on retreat, I go on solitary retreat. I do lead and will be leading this year group retreats and stuff like that. But even there, the emphasis is on the personal practice of each individual. It's not congregational. And I think this is another thing that needs to be looked at is just because Abrahamic faith traditions have created a relationship to congregational faith practice does not mean that we all need to do that too. And there are several benefits to perhaps not doing that. One is the incredible cost, right? I mean, when we find ourselves in, like, we're in this place in American culture now where more and more people with each successive generation are not identifying with any particular faith tradition. Why seek to replicate these models that might be dying? And so how to look at this in a way of empowering practitioners to be able to go deeply within themselves. And because ultimately how you or I or any of the listeners here experience klesha reactivity or experience resting into the nature of mind, that is an intensely personal thing. And it's not to say you shouldn't practice together, but it's also not to say we always need to sit in a big room together. And of course, when we look at the composty, nasty, death, hard, challenging, really nitty-gritty, hard tantric aspects of practice, that's it. The metaphor of alchemy is actually much more interesting to me because it all happens in a container, right? And so you have this container and the alchemical process goes, and the alchemist is making changes and adjustments bit by bit. And the alchemist isn't in the middle of the square, like the town square. The alchemist is in this controlled environment to be able to affect that change. And perhaps that should be the point of orientation rather than a congregational faith set, because that creates a lot of samsara.
There's that relational piece again of the health that comes from being in connection and people needing to be in connection, and yet the detriment that happens of constantly needing other people to confirm your practice or confirm your spiritual nature, like you're spiritual as a person to begin with. All of that we really see right now in our culture, and it says a lot to just do your practice, to compost without needing these outer confirmations. As someone's listening and they want to move out of this conversation into kind of like a post-conversation, post-meditative experience, what would you recommend people can turn their mind to to continue their awareness and their connection to their nature just as they're moving through onwards from now.
What I'm drawn to these days with practice is suddenly, gently resting in the moment, right? Allowing your body to just relax and allowing your gaze to be open and vast, and your mind to settle into vast, primordially pure spaciousness. Easy. And this is something that we could do immediately after this, or as we move through the day. What does it mean to easily rest into the solidity of the experience of our body? So we could be perhaps getting into a car and going to go run an errand. So sitting and then taking a moment to experience visual consciousness in a way that is in a way that does not have preference, non-preference, just letting it be even, not favoring one appearance or one thing that's arising over the other. And then depending, resting our mind into the experience of spaciousness, right? Awareness, trusting into awareness as space, and gently cultivating that as much as we can, bit by bit. Sit down when you have a moment and rest into that. When you need a shift in whatever you're doing, do that. And because this is why this is so profound is it's about breaking up the constancy of the thread of my narrative, whoever it is that we think we are. And when we, each individual kind of moment, that's, depending on how you want to think of it, it could be like individually fractured by just resting back into spaciousness. And then, just for a couple moments, and then back to whatever it is we're doing, and then doing that again. Doing it. This is a little bit like that creation and completion dynamic, Olivia, you mentioned, right? Because infinitely, we will create the solid samsaric being experience. And this is a way of just offering a gentle counter to it. And it's through these cracks that we begin to see that there's something else there. There's an experience that is other than, I need to do this stuff today and tomorrow and this week and this year and this life. There is something beyond our ideas about what Tantra is. There's something beyond our need to control. There's something beyond our concern for making sure that things are exactly the way I need them to be. And I think the more we're able to crack that really rough, hard, crystallized facade, the more we're able to let in the light of natural being, primordial purity, Buddha nature, Rigpa. And I also tend to feel, more so these days than in the past, that with the existence of those fractures, the mind tends towards moving through them. It's not that it is just this inert thing. And this is another strange thing, right? Is I need to do all of this work. No. We are light. We are bliss. We are love. We are all of these things. And so as we begin to crack open the hard, predetermined self that is this thing that keeps everything together, it begins to naturally radiate on its own. And it's not to say, oh, just do that and then you're good. But it is to say, I think if you do that, things will start to change.